Sewing can be really expensive, but it also doesn't have to be. In today's video, I'm going to be running through all of my sewing costs for 2024 so you can get an insight into how much sewing costs on an ongoing basis. If you're a beginner and you're wondering how much sewing costs, then this video is for you, but you might also find it helpful if you're a regular sewist and you want to compare your own costs. It's really important for me to be transparent with you, and it's also good encouragement and motivation for both me and you to keep track of our costs and to ensure that sewing continues to be a beautiful but sustainable hobby. Feel free to use the timestamps to navigate through this video. I'll be covering off on my own personal sewing context, including some of my philosophy around spending and some caveats. Then I'll also run through the actual figures themselves for 2024, and I've broken these down into some key categories. So those categories are sewing patterns, thrifting, learning, supplies, fabric, and then machine costs. I'll also give some reflections as I go about some of the numbers there. Finally, if you stick around to the end, I'll have some tips about how you can reduce your expenses and also my recommendations on what to invest in if you do have a little bit of extra money that you want to put towards your sewing to level up your equipment or to level up your sewing game. If you're new here, my name's Alex. I post sewing and fashion content here on YouTube. I'm a relatively new to sewing, so follow along to join me on my learning journey, and if you enjoy this video, then please boop the like button below. But without further ado, let's get into it. First things first, before I reveal the actual numbers, I wanted to be clear about my personal circumstances so that you can put my spending into context. Firstly, I'm not a full-time sewist. Sewing is a hobby of mine and I do it in the evenings or on the weekends. So my costs are probably lower than someone who is a full-time sewist or someone who sews for their job. Secondly, 2024 was the first year that I consistently sewed. What this means is that I have a lot of expenses that might be consistent with a beginner sewist, but at the same time I also had quite a few tools and supplies that I had purchased in 2023 which you won't see reflected in these costs. So just keep that in mind. If you're at the very beginning of your sewing journey, there might be a few more startup costs for you. Thirdly, sewing is my main hobby, so it takes up a large portion of my discretionary expenditure, and that's a personal decision for me and my finances. I don't spend a lot of money on things like going out or on exercise subscriptions or things like that, but I do really like investing in sewing equipment and supplies so that I can create beautiful things. Fourthly, on that note, I did buy a new sewing machine in 2024, right at the end of 2024, which I'm so excited about, and I'll share a video about that soon, but that is a large portion of my expenses in this video, so just keep that in mind. I started off my sewing journey using my mum's old machine, so I definitely recommend, if you're new to sewing, if you can borrow a friend's machine or you can get a cheap secondhand machine, then that's the best way to go. You don't need to spend so much money on a new machine up front. Finally, if you can't tell by the accent, I live in Australia, so all of the dollar figures in this video are in Australian dollars. I will try to put up the US dollar equivalent just so you have a reference point, but yeah, keep that in mind as you're watching this video. Also, I'm pretty sure sewing supply costs are pretty similar around the world, but they might vary a bit depending on where you live, so keep that in mind as well. The main takeaway from that is that I'm just one person, and how much money I choose to spend on sewing could vary quite differently from the next person, so just have a think about your own personal context and what is appropriate for you. My general belief about sewing is that it doesn't have to be an expensive hobby. At the end of the day, all you need to sew is some thread, a needle, and some fabric. You don't even need a machine. It's perfectly acceptable to just hand sew. So it can be quite minimal if you want it to be, and there are ways that you can keep costs down, but sewing is a hobby where it is really easy to spend a lot of money if that's what you want to do and that's what you can afford to do. It's completely personal, and it depends on things like what your budget is, whether you sew part-time or full-time, how much you're making throughout the year, whether you're creating things for other people, and what the quality of your supplies are, and also whether you're making things to replace other things that you'd be purchasing otherwise. For example, if you're making clothes so that you didn't have to buy them in store. All of those things could impact how much you might spend on sewing. But anyway, that's a lot of rambling. Let's just get straight into the numbers while you're all here. So category 1 is sewing patterns, and I spent $60.34 on sewing patterns in 2024. That included 4 sewing patterns, so that was an average of about $15 each. And I bought 2 patterns from Kiana Bonolo, 1 from Soften Studio, and 1 from Roberts Wood. And I think there are a few of these that I purchased on sale because often pattern designers do have regular sales throughout the year, so definitely keep an eye out for those. Category number 2 is thrifted clothes to upcycle or thrifted fabrics such as bed sheets. In 2024, I spent $132 at the thrift store for these purposes. I will say that most of these were clothes to thrift flip, and I have a big pile that I have to work my way through, but there were quite a few good bed sheets in there as well. And for reference, this amount was about 4 trips to the thrift store. So that was about $30 per trip, which if you've ever been to a thrift store, you know that you can get actually a lot of stuff for $30. So category 3 is learning. In 2024, I spent $137 on learning, and that was just for 1 pattern making course by Nancy Tauber, and I started it at the end of the year. So I'm still working my way through that, and I'm really enjoying it. If you're interested in it, then let me know and I can speak more about that. But yeah, that's what I spent on learning. Generally, I will use YouTube for most of my learning because there's so many wonderful people here, and also because it's a free resource, of course. But I do believe in investing in myself and in my learning if there's a product that I think will be particularly valuable to me, or if I want the structure of a longer course just to keep me accountable and also to make sure that I'm really across the foundational principles that I need to succeed. Category 4 is sewing supplies, and in 2024 I spent $493 on sewing supplies, and let me tell you that I was quite shocked by this because it seemed like a lot to me. This wasn't even fabric, this was things like thread, elastic, batten, interfacing, like little notions like I got a little overlocking needle to pull the threads through. Just a lot of random things like that, and I wouldn't have expected it to cost this much. Some of the transactions were at Spotlight, which is like a big craft store in Australia, so there might be a little bit of fabric costs that have snuck into this number because I've tracked my finances by transaction, not itemized. But yeah, I was shocked by this one. I wasn't expecting the number to be so high. I don't really know what the cost drivers for that are. I know that I did spend quite a bit on some really nice thread for my new machine, but that doesn't account for everything. So I think this year in 2025, as I track my finances, I'm going to pay more attention to my itemized receipts as opposed to just looking at my transactions as a whole, so I can unpack this a bit more and understand where I'm actually spending my money and where this is coming from. On to category 5, which is fabric, and in 2024 I spent $493 on fabric. So as you can see, fabric can be quite expensive, and I think this is where you can get quite a lot of cost variation. For me in 2024, about half of this expense came from 1 transaction at the fabric store, which is a dead stock fabric provider in Australia, and I think I bought maybe 6 meters of some decently expensive fabrics, and yeah, as you can see, that completely added up. For reference, a meter of fabric could cost anything from a few dollars for the cheapest fabrics to more like $15 to $20 for your standard fabrics, and then anything between like $30 and $40 is getting expensive, and then 50 plus is really expensive in my opinion, because if you think about it, if you had a $50 per meter fabric, you had a 3 meter fabric dress, that's already $150 just for the material, and not even accounting for things like the other supplies and labor and things like that. So anyway, that's what I spent on fabric in 2024. The final category is machine costs, and this is the big ticket item because I bought a new machine in 2024 and that came to a whopping $1,990. So that completely blew out the budget. I got a Juki straight stitch machine and I had been dreaming about it for a long time, and I finally just bit the bullet and purchased it. When my birthday was coming around, if people were asking me what would you like, I did say please donate to my new sewing machine fund, so that helped out a little bit. But yeah, it's still a very expensive purchase and it's not a decision to be made lightly. To be clear, you do not have to spend this much money on a sewing machine. literally borrow a machine off a friend, get one secondhand, or get a kind of cheap one if you're just starting out, just to see if you're actually going to be enjoying sewing as a hobby. And then when you're confident that you're going to be doing it long term, you can think about investing in a better sewing machine if you want to. The rest of the money in this category came from getting my machines serviced, so that included my mum's old sewing machine and also the overlocker that I have, and those services were about $150 and $175. One of them was more expensive because the machine just hadn't been serviced in a while and it really needed a thorough service. So this is your sign to make sure that you get your machine serviced, because it really helps with your sewing long term, and just make sure that everything is in perfect working condition. So if you've been doing the math as I've been running through the numbers, then you would know that the total for 2024 that I spent on my sewing hobby was $3,636.02. So that is quite a bit of money for a hobby. And as you can see, the costs can totally stack up. But I would say that the total cost without the machine cost category was $1,317. So that's a more reasonable indication of what you might spend in a year of sewing on an ongoing basis. But as I said, it's really person dependent. So now you know my sewing costs in 2024. What can we learn from this? Well, I have a few tips and reflections to share. There are a few ways that you can reduce your expenses if you need to. You can get secondhand fabric. For example, if you go to the op shop and get sheets and blankets, these can be really handy to either practice sewing, or if you manage to find nice fabric, you can create actual garments out of this. It's perfectly usable and a great thing for the environment as well as the bank. You can also shop your own wardrobe. You can look through and find pieces that you don't gravitate to anymore, and you can either upcycle them and kind of tweak the original design, or you could just completely rip apart the garment and then use that fabric for another project. So that's how you can kind of reduce fabric costs. You should also buy fabric and supplies with a specific project in mind. If you've been sewing for any length of time, you know that it's so tempting sometimes to just buy like the beautiful fabric, but if you don't have a specific idea in mind for it, often it can go sit unused in your shelf, and that is just such a shame and such a waste. If your birthday is coming up and people are asking what to get you, well, you could always direct them to sewing supplies, because that's quite a friendly way to help with your sewing expenditure. And also, people should be able to find an appropriate gift within their budget. As I touched on before, normally indie pattern makers do put on sales for their patterns, so if you have your eye on a specific pattern, then wait for the sale period. On a similar vein, I would only purchase a pattern when you're planning to sew it. So some of the patterns that I purchased in 2024 I immediately used, but some of them I am yet to use, and I think it's just better to just purchase it when you're going to use it, so that you don't risk never using it. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's worth mentioning. On the machine front, as I said, you don't need to buy a machine, just borrow one from a friend. Also, you should check out maker spaces, which they might have in your city. They have them in Melbourne. It's basically like a library for machines, and you can go and use their different machines for your projects. I've only recently found out about this in Melbourne, so I haven't checked it out yet, but I will soon, hopefully, and I can report back on how that is. The final cost-saving tip is to understand how many meters of fabric that you need for a project before you purchase the fabric. This will reduce the amount of fabric waste that you have for your project. Normally, if you've purchased a pattern, it will let you know how much fabric that pattern should use. Otherwise, if you're not going off a pattern, maybe just do some quick maths before you head to the fabric shop. I will admit that understanding how much fabric a project uses is something that I need to work on. Hopefully it's a skill that develops more over time, because I always think it's better to have more rather than less, and so I've definitely been in the situation where I have way too much fabric than I actually need. But yeah, in an ideal world, you'd have the perfect amount of fabric that you need for your project. Those are all my cost saving tips. What about tips for what you should invest in as a sewist? I'm sure different people will have different opinions on this, but from my experience with sewing, I think it's important to invest in good quality thread. If you're using old threads or cheap threads, then they're susceptible to break, and that can really ruin the integrity of your whole garment or your whole creation. I also think if you see a beautiful fabric that you like and you can afford to purchase it, then I've never regretted those decisions. You can create some really beautiful things, really high quality things with nice fabric. So I would never feel bad about those decisions, especially if you're only purchasing like a meter or two. Obviously, if you're thinking about purchasing like 10 meters for some big project or creating multiple products, then that's something that you should think about a little bit harder. But in general, investing in good quality fabric is worth it. I also think if you've been sewing for a little while now and you think that you are going to be sewing for a really long time, for 5 or 10 plus years, then investing in a sewing machine is a really nice thing to do if you can save up for it and you can afford it, because it does bring so much joy. It's an investment in yourself and an investment in your craft, and it means that you'll be able to continue to create beautiful pieces. And then, of course, don't skip on getting your machine serviced each year, just to make sure that everything stays in great working order. Finally, if you like someone's pattern, then I definitely think you should purchase it. Patterns generally aren't too expensive, and it's really nice to support other designers, particularly indie pattern makers, in my opinion. And it's really handy if you find a pattern maker that you love and you know that their patterns generally fit well and they come with great instructions and potentially even a video tutorial. All of that will really help you enjoy the sewing process and to create great homemade pieces. So that's all of my 2024 sewing costs and my tips and tricks for saving and investing in sewing. If you're interested in what I made in 2024, then check this video out. Otherwise, I hope you have a super epic day.